The third lecture is Hasidism in Medieval Germany, from Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. 1. Medieval German Jewry held aloof from the discussions of theological and philosophical problems which exercise so deep an influence on contemporary Jewish thought in the East, in Spain, and in Italy, which gave an impetus to new and important developments in the cultural life of these communities. The introduction of new values and ideas into the fields of metaphysics, ethics, and anthropology by the Jewish theologians and philosophers of the period. The whole movement, which can be described as the struggle between Plato and Aristotle for the biblical and Talmudic heritage of Judaism, was all but ignored by the Jewish communities of Germany and northern France. True, the study of the Talmud was pursued with an enthusiasm which was nowhere surpassed. Nowhere else was so much importance assigned to learning, so much zeal developed in the pursuit of study, but this interest in the casuistry of the Holy Law was not paralleled by a similar genius for or devotion to speculative thought. That, however, is not to say that German Jewry made no significant contribution to the history of Jewish religion in the diaspora. Its spiritual leaders were indeed strangely devoid of originality in the domain of metaphysics. They showed themselves unable to turn to the productive account even the few elements of philosophic speculation which were gradually absorbed, but a significant and lasting imprint was made on the spirit of this great Jewish community by the upheaval of the Crusades, by the savage persecutions of the period, and the Jews' own constant readiness for martyrdom. Henceforth, there was to be a novel element in the character of German Judaism, an element which owed its growth to purely religious motives, but which never found adequate philosophic expression. Its mark is to be found in the movement to which the name of German Hasidism has been given, i.e. in the activities of certain groups of men whom their contemporaries already called with special emphasis Hasid Ashkenaz, i.e. the devout of Germany. And let us remember that there's, I forget each of the words, but Ashkenaz is one of the, Tanakh had 3 separate versions after they decided how many rows and columns and letters. And Ashkenaz was one of them. The others further in Asia, the others south and west, right? Over by Africa. The rise of Hasidism was the decisive event in the religious development of German Jewry. Of all the factors determining the deeper religion of that community, it was the greatest until the change which took place in the 17th century under the influence of the later Kabbalism, which originated at Safed in Palestine. Strictly speaking, it was only a considerable religious event in the history of German Judaism. Its importance lies in the fact that it succeeded already during the Middle Ages in bringing about the triumph of new religious ideas and values which were acknowledged by the mass of the people in Germany, and for the German Jewish community, at any rate, the victory was complete. Where the 13th century Kabbalism of Spain failed, for it became a real historical factor only much later, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and after Safed had become the new center. German Hasidism succeeded so far from being isolated. The Hasidim were intimately connected with the whole of Jewish life and the religious interests of the common folk. They were recognized as representatives of an ideally Jewish way of life, even where their principles were never completely translated into practice, side by side with the great documents of the Halakha, and in spite of their deep reverence for the divine commandment, by no means always in perfect conformity with them. The classical literature of Hasidism retained a truly canonical prestige, not indeed among the representatives of Talmudic learning, who can hardly have read documents like the Book of the Devout without experiencing some qualms, but with the average pious Jewish burgher or householder, the Baal Bayith. Thus, the Hasidim escaped the fate of the early Kabbalists, who always remained a small aristocratic sect, and whose ideas and values never entered into the general consciousness of their contemporaries. Although the creative period of the movement was relatively short, about 1 century from 1150 of the Common Era to 1250 of the Common Era, its influence on the Jews of Germany was lasting. The religious ideas to which it gave rise and which it filled with life retained their vitality for centuries. It is to them that German Jewry largely owes the inner strength and devotion which it displayed when new storms of persecution arose. Like the Talmud, aristocracy before it, Hasidism found its leading representatives among that remarkable family which for centuries provided the Jewish communities in the Rhineland with their spiritual leaders, the Canaanite Medes, who had come to the Rhine from Italy and who, in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, formed a natural aristocracy among the communities. The three men who molded all German Hasidism belonged to this family: Samuel the Hasid, the son of Kalonimus of Speyer, who lived in the middle of the 12th century, his son Yehuda the Hasid of Worms, who died in Regensburg in 1217 of the Common Era, and the latter's disciple and relative Eliezer ben Yehuda of Worms, who died between 1223 and 1232. I think in German you'd say Yehuda, not Jew, you don't say Jew. All three exercised a deep and lasting influence on their contemporaries. Yehuda the Hasid in particular held an unrivaled position as a religious leader so long as Hasidism itself remained a living force. A contemporary said of him, he would have been a prophet if he had lived in the times of the prophets. That's not how it works, but okay. But that was what was said. Like Isaac Luria of Safed in the latter age, he too soon became a legendary figure of mythical proportions, and in much the same way, the personalities of the other two leaders of German Hasidism tend to disappear behind the tropical jungle of legends that has grown up around them. These legends have been preserved not only in Hebrew, but also in a Yiddish version. The Masa book, which Gaster has translated into English, they do not always give a true picture of what Hasidism actually was, but rather tell us what popular imagination would have liked it to be, and in this distortion too is not without significance for an understanding of the motive powers which were active in this movement. Of Samuel the Hasid's writings, little has been preserved, while the more numerous writings of his son Yehuda have come down for the most part only in the form given to them by his disciples. On the other hand, Eliezer of Worms, the most zealous of all the apostles of his master, has left a whole literature which is a veritable storehouse of early Hasidic thought, including up in particular the entire body of earlier mystical doctrine. Insofar as it was known to the members of this group, indeed his life work seems to have been devoted to the task of codification, whether of the Halakha in his great work Roke'eh, of which several editions have appeared in print, or of other materials and traditions, his voluminous writings, many of them extant only in manuscripts, of which a distinguished Jewish scholar once remarked that he had hoped they would never emerge from their well-deserved oblivion, are of considerable interest for the study of Jewish mysticism, but the most important literary monument of the movement, which gives the full insight into its origins and its originality, is the Sefer Hasidim, or the Book of the Devout, an edition of the literary testaments of the three founders, and in particular the writings of Yehuda the Hasid. Undistinguished and even awkward in style, often resembling a mass of causal jottings rather than a coherent literary composition, it is yet undoubtedly one of the most important and remarkable products of Jewish literature. No other work of the period provides us with so deep an insight into the real life of a Jewish community in all its aspects. For once, we are able to study religion and theology, not detached from reality, and as it was suspended in the vacuum of revelation, but in the closest and most intimate connection with everyday life, where other authors or editors have drawn a dogmatic, halakhic, or idyllic veil before the living reality of religious experience. The book records in plain words the actual conflicting motives which determine the religious life of a Jew in medieval Germany. Life, as it is presented here, although lived in the shadow of a great idea, is painted with a realism which has an almost dramatic quality. Thus, the Book of the Devout inaugurates the all-too-brief series of Jewish writings, not a few of them, and not the least valuable, written at a later stage in the development of Jewish mysticism, which are also genuine historical documents, revealing the whole truth about the circumstances of their time. In his brilliant analysis of the religious social tendency of the Sefer Hasidim, F.I. Bar has shown that the teachings of the Sefer Hasidim form a definitive and constant whole, and that they reflect the spirit of a central dominating figure, Rabbi Judah the Hasid. Jehuda the Hasid, whose historical position, according to Bar, is akin to that of his Christian contemporary, St. Francis of Assisi. Bar has raised anew the problem of the relationship between the social philosophy of Hasidism and its monkish Christian environment. It is in fact undeniable that certain popular religious and social ideas come to the Roman Catholic West after the Clunia Ascension reform. The Cluniacensian reform also filtered into the religious philosophy of some Jewish groups. According to Bar, this was possible only in Germany, while in Italy and Spain the spread of philosophical enlightenment among the Jews either prevented the infiltration or at least limited its scope by conducting an incessant fight against it. Although Bar describes these tendencies as stimulants which merely serve to hasten a spontaneous development, he goes further than Gudemann, who also believed in a connection between the popular Christian mysticism of the period and the Hasidic movement, but makes a reservation in respect of their interdependence by arguing that there is no need to speak of derivations. Similar causes produce similar effects. Mysticism was in the air, and its seeds fell on fertile soil, both among Jews and Christians. Part 2. It would, however, be a mistake to assume that the impact upon the Jewish religious consciousness of the terrible sufferings during the Crusades was the source of an entirely novel mystical disposition. The truth is that long before this period and long before the great body of a lay Christianity had come under the influence of mystical thoughts, which in turn could have penetrated into Jewish circles. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland, the cultural center of German Jewry, had begun to absorb elements of the early Merkabah mysticism. It seems probable that this infiltration of an older tradition in whose wake an entire literature was transplanted coincided with the immigration during the 9th century, the Common Era, of the already mentioned Kalan Imida family. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. From Italy, were through the tireless activity of Aaron of Baghdad. An understanding of this literature has spread among wider circles. The extent to which this renaissance of Merkabah mysticism on Italian soil has gone can be gauged from the legends in the Chronicle of Ahimaz of Oria, a precious document of the 11th century Jewish life which has been preserved as though by a miracle in the library of the Cathedral of Toledo. And one has only to read the religious poetry of the Jews of southern Italy in the 10th century, the Common Era, especially the hymns of Amitai ben Shephatiah, to become aware of the enormous influence of Merkabah mysticism, both on its style and its contents. That the Sefer Yetzirah was already known in Italy in the 10th century is proved by the commentary of Sabbatai Danilo. Together with it, there came a great deal of related literature, semi-mystical, or entirely mystical midrashim, various documents of whose existence we only know through quotations scattered in the writings of the Hasidim. The influence of this literature on the Jews of Germany was profound. One finds its reflection in the writings of the old synagogal poets of the German and Northern French school, which carried on the tradition of Palestine and Italy. This poetry is frequently incomprehensible unless one is familiar with the Merkabah literature. The voluminous commentary on a large number of these poems, compiled by Abraham ben Ezrael of Bohemia, publication of which has lately been started, deals largely with mystical ideas. It is quite obvious, though less generally realized, that the writings of many Talmudists and Tosafists, the name generally given to the school of Talmudic casuists in Germany and northern France in the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, insofar as they deal at all with religious subjects, are steeped in the same kind of mystical thought. The tradition which ascribes to some of the most famous Tosafists a preference for the study of old mystical tracts, if not the actual practice of mystical rites, is by no means simply a legend. The various testimonies to this effect are quite independent of each other, and for the rest, a careful study of their occasional ventures into theology leaves no doubt that they draw their inspiration from mystical ideas on the subject of creation. The Merkabah and even the She'er Koma, one of the greatest masters of this school of casuists, Isaac of Dampierre, whom one would be the last to suspect of mystical leanings, was said to be a visionary. We have a commentary to the Book of Creation written by Elhanan ben Yakar of London, which was based on his lectures, and one of his most famous pupils, Ezra of Montcontour, whose cognomen, the prophet, was by no means intended to be merely an honorific appellation, is known to have practiced Merkabah mysticism. His ascents to heaven are attested by several witnesses, and his possession of prophetic gifts was regarded as proof. He showed signs and miracles. One heard a voice speak to him from a cloud, as God spoke to Moses. Great scholars among them, Eliezer Worms, after days of fasting and prayer, were granted the revelation that all his words were truth and not deception. He also produced Talmudic explanations, the like of which had never been heard before, and he revealed the mysteries of the Torah and the prophets. And when he announced that the Messianic age would begin in 1226 of the Common Era and culminate in 1240, the year 5000 of creation, the rumor of this prediction spread far and wide. That's how we know he wasn't a real prophet of God, at the very least. And there's a difference between a prophet and somebody who works himself into psychedelic states, because the sensual, emotional, psychiatric, high that comes through mystical practice is not quite on the spiritual level now, is it? It's put in a spiritual context, but it's not, These traditions concerning the way of life and the vision of the old ecstatics by which the imagination continued to be powerfully affected, although only a few followed in their footsteps, combined probably in the main during the period of the Crusades with various other and often quite heterogeneous elements of thought. Thus the ideas of Sa'ad, the soberest of philosophic rationalists, who flourished in the first half of the 10th century, gradually became known, and paradoxically enough, they gained influence owing to the poetical, enthusiastic, and quasi-mystical style of the old Hebrew translation, or rather paraphrase of his magnum opus, the book of philosophic doctrines and religious beliefs, the original of which was written in Arabic. Apart from partially misunderstood elements of Sa'diyya, there was the growing influence of Abraham ibn Ezra and Abraham bar Hia, through which Neoplatonic thought, including some of the purely mystical character, came to northern France into the Hasidism of Germany. The stream also carried along with it an indefinable mixture of traditions concerning occultism, of which the sources are difficult to trace. The most extraordinary combinations of Hellenistic occultism, early Jewish magic, and ancient German belief in demons and witches are frequently encountered in the Hasidic literature of this period. It is characteristic that Eliezer of Worms uses the term philosopher in the same sense in which it was used in the Mediaeval. I expected a different spelling. In the medieval Latin writings on alchemy and occultism, i.e., as a designation of a scholar versed in these occult sciences. Wherever in his book on psychology a philosopher makes his appearance, he introduces hermetical ideas of this kind. All these elements are intermingled in the richly varied literature of Hasidism, but rather in the form of an amorphous whole than as elements of a system. Its authors, as we have already had occasion to remark, showed themselves unable to develop these elements of thought or to produce anything like a synthesis. Possibly they were not even conscious of the manifold inconsistencies among the various traditions, all of which were treated by them with the same reverence. As regards the form of their writings, it is worth noting that they displayed nothing of the passion for anonymity, let alone the pseudepigraphy, which is so characteristic of the Merkabah mystics. Only a very small number of the pseudepigraphic texts grouped round the figure of one Joseph ben Uziel, who first makes his appearance in the alphabet of Ben Sira of the 10th century of the Common Era, where he is introduced as the grandson of Ben Sira and the great-grandson of the prophet Jeremiah. And even there, it is not certain whether some of these texts, and possibly the alphabet as well, did not originate in Italy. Whatever else there is to be found of pseudepigraphical elements in this literature apparently owes its origin less to deliberate intention than to misunderstanding and confusion, such as, for example, the awkward commentary on the Book of Creation written by a disciple of Eleazar of Worms, but published under the name of Saadia, for Saadia was actually considered by Hasidism as learned in the mysteries. So we see that pseudographic texts don't stop with Tanakh and side books that were not included in canonization or couldn't have been included because they were too late. It continues in with talking about the mystics and stuff themselves. Like you can't have a new mystic of each generation, right? Part 3. Notwithstanding the failure to establish doctrinal unity, or rather the lack of any serious attempt to bring it about, well, there never was one Judaism, as far as we know. Around the second book of Maccabees being written, and you have the name appear. There was obviously more than one type. When the influence of the Persian priests and the side cults kind of blended, but you could still, but you had something you could call Judaism about 540 BCE. So don't put it back that far, but I've put it back that far. I've given my reasons elsewhere. I came to that conclusion anyways. There wasn't one Judaism, so yeah. Anyways. These writings, with all their manifold contradictions and inconsistencies, display a certain community of outlook. The new impulse which deeply affected the precarious life led by the German Jews in the 12th century left a powerful imprint on the character of their literature. Its spirit somehow permeates even the semi-philosophic arguments, the ancient mythologisms scattered among the fragments, and the rest of this stream of traditions and reminiscences replete with obvious misunderstandings and not infrequent showing a reversion to mythology. Well, mythology is there's meaning and purpose behind what you're engaging here, you know. For, like the external world, the world of the spirit too had undergone a deep transformation. The force of the religious impulse, which at one time found expression and satisfaction in the visionary perception of God's glory and in the apocalyptic vision of the downfall of the fiendish powers of evil, had waned and for a time ceased to shape the outlook of actively religious groups. Nothing indeed disappeared completely. All the old traditions were preserved, often in abstruse metamorphosis. For, in this Hasidic world, age is its own justification, but in spite of the innate conservatism of German Judaism, the novel circumstances in the end called forth a new response. It will always remain a remarkable fact that the great catastrophe of the Crusades, the incessant waves of persecution which now broke over the Jews of Germany, failed to introduce an apocalyptic element into the religious tenets of German Jewry. Not a single apocalypse was written during that period unless this name be given to the no longer extant prophecy of Rabbi Troestlin the prophet, the work of a Merkabah mystic who lived in Erfurt and of whose book a brief passage has been preserved. It is true that the chroniclers of the persecutions and the writers of the new school of religious poetry, perhaps the most characteristic representatives of this period, sought consolation in eschatological hopes, but they laid far more stress on the blessed state of the martyrs and the transcendent splendor of the coming redemption than on the terrors of the end and the vision of the Last Judgment. As far as concerns the views of the Hasidic leaders, Jehuda the Hasid himself was radically opposed to all speculation concerning the time of the Messiah's arrival. Now, if you look at Tanakh, there was not one Messiah, but perhaps the idea that it was apparent there weren't any authentic ones left by a certain point. People said, we just want one more, In chronicling the account of the journey of Ptah of Regensburg, who made a voyage to Baghdad in Persia around 1175, he went so far as to censor the manuscript by leaving out the messianic prophecy of one Samuel, an astrologer of Nineveh, so that it might not seem as though he believed in it. And in the Book of the Devout, he says, if you see one making prophecies about the Messiah, you should know that he deals in witchcraft and has intercourse with demons. Sometimes, I'm sure, but I'm sure people make it up a lot more. Some people are confused, but yeah, somebody could be true. It doesn't mean that, anyways. Quote continued, he is one of those who seek to conjure with the names of God. Now, since they conjure the angels or spirits, these tell them about the Messiah so as to tempt him to reveal his speculations. Because God's angels can't be conjured as such. The jinn can, sure, and in the end, he is shamed because he has called up the angels and demons, and instead a misfortune occurs at that place. The demons come and teach him their calculations and apocalyptic secrets in order to shame him and those that believe in him. For no one knows anything about the coming of the Messiah. Well, wouldn't Scripture have talked about that sort of things? But for all the lack of apocalyptic elements and the messianic conception of Hasidism, it would have been a mistake to overlook its eschatological character. There have been tendencies in this direction, thus J.N. Simhoni, one of the few writers on the subject who have tried to go below the surface, has drawn a picture of Hasidism as a movement distinguished by a frankly anti-eschatological form of devotion which holds out no expectations of reward in life for meritorious deeds, ignores the hope of salvation, and remains resolutely welded to the present. If heavy misfortune befall a man, let him think of the knights who go to war and do not flee before the sword, for they are ashamed to flee, and so as not to expose themselves to shame, they let themselves be killed or wounded, and they receive no reward from their masters for their death